Hey, thank you so much for attending our LinkedIn Live for real world testing. My name is Heather Kelty, and I am the Certification Program Director here at Drummond Group. I am here with Jimmy Laycock, my colleague.
Thanks, Heather. I am Jimmy Laycock, Certification Audit Manager, Drummond Group. So it's hard to believe we're in the second week of August. End of the summer is only a few short weeks away. And with that brings the 2024 Real World Test Plan submission window is only just about a month away. So early September is when that opens up. So heading into the third year of the real world testing cycle, we just wanted to chat today about some best practices and lessons learned with any health IT developers in attendance. The ONC's intention with the real world testing program requirement is to provide public transparency of interoperability related performance for all certified health IT products. So with that requirement, I just wanted to start off with just a couple of important, more high level requirements about real world testing, and then we'll discuss, more of the nitty gritty details as we move on. So the first thing is, who does real world testing apply to? So really it comes down to the timing of when your product is certified and which criteria you certify to. So any criteria that's certified before August 31st of any given year that has real world testing applicability needs to be included in your following year's real world test plan. So for this year, for example, anything certified now or prior to now up until August 31st will need to be included in your 2024 real world test plan. So the criteria that has real world testing applicability isn't, every single certified criteria that the ONC has, but there's a subset that needs to be included. So that includes the B criteria, so often referred to as the care coordination criteria, which includes transitions of care, clinical information reconciliation, electronic prescribing, and so forth. Clinical quality measures, so C1, 2, and 3, those have to be included with real world test plans. The patient engagement criteria, so specifically E1, view, download, transmit, that needs to have real world testing done. The different public health criteria, so all the F1s, so immunization, syndromic, other public health reporting criteria. Also the API criteria, so G7, G9, and G10 moving forward, along with H1 and H2, so those electronic exchange ones, the ones that relate to direct messaging. So all of those, given that you're certified before August 31st, need to be included in your following real world test plan. In addition to crafting that plan, it does need to be made accessible publicly on your website.
So, Jimmy, does this mean that for this coming year that I just replace the plan that I all had from last year, or potentially the year before, with the new one, or does that mean I have to include all of them? Kind of what does that mean from a public standpoint?
No, great question. So any year you participated in the real world test program, you need to make sure those are all available via one publicly accessible website. So the ONC refers to this as more like a landing or an index page. So from that main landing page or index page, you do need to have all of your past and then your current and obviously future real world test plans accessible. It really just goes back to that public transparency requirement. They want to see kind of how things progressed as you moved along in the real world testing program.
Yeah, so another question we got a lot during this time is, what's your guidance around when everything should be live on that? Can we wait? Can the developer wait until 12/15, or what's your guidance around that and things that we've run into along the way?
Yeah, so when it comes to deadlines, there's an ONC deadline, which is that December 15th that you mentioned, Heather. But there's actually a sooner deadline that ACBs have. That way we can review it, make sure it meets all the requirements, and get it posted on the chapel for that December 15th deadline. So whereas each ACB may have a different deadline, Drummond's deadline is November 1st to have them submitted. That way we have that 5 or 6 week period, to review it, make sure it's posted publicly, and then get it onto the chapel before that deadline from the ONC. The reason why we have that few 6 week prior period is, again, we need to make sure there's certain data elements included, make sure, again, it's publicly accessible, and then get it on the chapel for that deadline. Because as some of you may be aware, real world testing is actually a condition and maintenance of certification. So, you have to meet certain requirements of this condition of real world testing as part of just ongoing certification maintenance for your product. So if you don't do a portion of this, such as making it available via that public URL, you may have to say that you're, non-compliant to that condition when you submit your semi-annual attestation twice a year. So obviously we want to make sure everybody's in compliant with all the program requirements, and that's why we have that kind of several week earlier deadline before the ONC one. Given that information, kind of those high level requirements, Heather, maybe let's talk a little bit about the elements or what has to be included in each of the plans.
Yeah, so each time the plan cycle comes around, as an ACB, there are several checks that we need to do against your real world test plan to make sure that everything is included. And that has certain elements that need to be included. So I kind of want to walk through a couple of those because we got a lot of questions during the year about what content should be included in each of those sections and what should be included. So we just want to make sure we kind of just covered that a little bit. So the first one really is the testing methodology. And that's really what's used to demonstrate the actual real world interoperability and conformance to the scope of the criterion that your certification actually has. So there's a wide range of factors that can be used to help showcase this conformance, such as when you're looking at the types of organizations that you have. Do you have small organizations? Do you have large organizations? The type of criteria utilization, right, across the different organizations. So kind of look at some of that utilization and try and figure out what's the best testing methodology that you need to use.
So when you say, the utilization of criteria, what happens if folks, have something that's out in production but nobody's utilizing it? Do they still need to perform real world testing, or can that just be ignored?
Yeah, so that, Jimmy, is a great question because it came up a lot during the review over the last few years. There is an option there where you have to include that. So if you have somebody that's really not utilizing certain criteria, we ran into this a lot with public health and some of the API even criteria. You still have to include those in your real world test plan, regardless of if anybody is using it or not. What the ONC allows you to do from a flexibility standpoint is you could do a mirrored production environment with some patient data that's test related. You can also link up with some of your local public health or partners where you can kind of show some of that testing, maybe not in a specific lab environment, but an almost lab environment. So those are some of the things that you could do, but you definitely still need to include that as part of your real world test plan. It doesn't discount you from having to do it just because you don't have anybody using it. So moving in to the next piece really is your care setting. So along with that, you need to make sure that you include these care settings so that you can show which testing methodology is being used for the markets that you are currently sharing across for care settings. So some of your methodologies could be the same across different care settings, but they could also be different, and then you're addressing them different, and you want to make sure that's in your plan. But either way, care settings have to be really inclusive as part of your plan. A couple more elements that need to be included: descriptions of how the developer will test and demonstrate conformance to all of the criteria and using all the versions of the adopted standards needs to be included in there. Also with relied upon software. I know we're kind of going to talk about that multiple times as well.
So when you say standards, Heather, do you mean like the baseline certification standards, or does that include SVAP, or what does that mean?
Yeah, so you want, as part of your testing plan, if you are not in the voluntary optional SVAP program, you need to make sure that your testing is around the adopted standards that you're currently at, which could be the baseline, right, that you received your certification at. But alongside with that, if you are enrolled and you've done the optional SVAP, meaning that you have adopted standards that aren't part of your baseline, those also need to be included in your plan, because you have to ensure that those are the standards that are being tested through your real world testing. And so those also get mentioned. So yes, you definitely want to make sure that you include the SVAP if that's something, that you're opted into. So couple other elements just to kind of move that is the schedule of the real world test milestones needs to be included. So this section is more really of an explanation of your project plan and the specifics about how you're going to execute the plan. So this could include things like timing around when you got together the customers that you're going to use for your real world test plan, when you started executing the test plan, when you started collecting results, when you're going to put your plan together formally. So this is just something to show that you have a plan to execute from start to finish for your plan. And then after that, it's really the expected outcomes of your real world test. So you as a developer really need to document the expected outcomes and how the approach that you chose, like through your methodology and through the people that you chose to help from your real world test, shows a successful demonstration of the conformance. So this would really include things like compliance with all the vocabulary sets, exchanging EHI in your proper care settings that you would have documented earlier, as well as any EHI that can be received into your product.
Okay. And how about like measurement metrics? How does that get documented in a plan?
I'm so glad you asked because we definitely is the most important part of the plan. And I think the portion that made the most stumbling blocks for developers is knowing the right types of measures and metrics to include. So one of the important things to know with an element is metric is that it's key to gauging the performance of your product. So you want to make sure that as a minimum from the ONC standpoint, you have at least one metric. But we always suggest that you kind of do more than one metric to show the full breadth of what your product can do for that specific criteria. Because there's lots of different things that you can add. But again, at a minimum, you have at least one metric that you need to do to gauge that performance.
And as far as metrics, I mean, could it be something as simple as like a yes or no? Could it be a pass fail, or is it actual like, percentage, or what is a suggestion for that?
Yeah, so a lot of people thought that they could just kind of use the test tool and just say, yes, I was able to pass everything, but it's really not about that. It has to be a measurable value. So it could be a numerical value, it could be an error rate, it could be usage analysis, whatever kind of measure you're using for your testing. A lot of times you can look at numerator and denominator information where it's possible because it's useful context to help you for usage analysis, like how many messages were sent, how many of them maybe failed the first time from an error rate standpoint. So there's lots of things you could do from a measurable standpoint, but you definitely don't want to do pass, fail, yes, no, because those are definitely things that we would send your plan back for. Because again, it needs to be something measurable to show interoperability and not just, yes, I passed a test. And then the last little element is really the justification around your real world test. So it's more like an overarching statement to say, here was the rationale behind how I chose to complete my real world test plans from the methodologies all the way down. And it's really how you determine that it's successful in its appropriate technique for deployment for your real world test. So that's kind of just a statement that needs to be in there. So those are just some of the elements from an ACB standpoint that we will look for to approve your plan, and also those are the requirements from the ONC specifically. So given those requirements, right, since we're in our third round, there's lots of lessons learned and questions, and kind of we felt like, I don't know, Jimmy, you probably feel this way, we repeated ourselves a lot because there was just a lot of confusion and clarification needed. So what are some lessons that we learned from our side really going through and evaluating each of these plans? So can you talk a little bit more about that piece of it?
Of course. Yeah. So, one question we often get is how to reflect any changes. So, say you submit your plan, obviously for the following calendar year, but in the course of your testing, there's some changes, change to a metric or whatnot. So once your plan has been approved, that becomes a static report. It should no longer be changed. It's published. basically anytime you make changes or need to make changes, that would actually be reflected in your results report. So you definitely should not go back and change anything mentioned in your previously approved plan.
So as a developer, I should not expect to change my plan and then go ahead and email my ACB with the changes and update my website after it's been submitted and approved, right?
Correct. Yeah. So the ONC even has a template that some folks can use. And there's a section specifically in the results template that talks about changes. So absolutely, once it's been approved, there is no changes to it. And as you mentioned, we won't be changing any. We won't be re-approving or re-reviewing any plans that were previously approved. So make sure that's where the results is where you would document that. And then another area, or maybe a common misconception in the first go round, the first year of real world testing related to inherited certification status. So there wasn't, maybe the clearest guidance in the past where, when I mentioned earlier, given the timing of when you need to submit real world testing of that August cutoff date, some folks, if they were certified, previously, and then they came out with a new version after that August deadline, they felt like maybe they didn't have to do real world testing for the following year, and then they just pick that up, in the year that follows that one. So the ONC did clarify that anytime you inherit a product from another, it needs to have real world testing, regardless of the timing of when that inheritance took place.
Yeah. So the myth really busted is that, to confirm, if the product that you have is certified after 8/31, but is an immediate inheritance from the previous product that had real world testing, even though it's after 8/31 on my new version, I still need to complete the real world testing because it's a direct inheritance of a product that did have real world test applicability to it, basically, right?
Exactly. Yep. So regardless of when it happened, as long as the product it was inherited from had real world testing, you automatically pick that up, regardless of when it was when the new version was certified. And then a couple other areas, that we kind of wove into our discussion earlier, but so anything that's non-deployed or low use capabilities, you definitely still need to mention those in the plan. Like you said earlier, Heather, if there's no, production use of something, you still need to, in a mere production environment or other similar environment with synthetic patient data, make sure that's, planned for in your plan, and then, later on in the results. Relied upon software, that's another common thing that we get questions on or have to, have folks make edits to. In the recent guidance, I think late last year from the ONC, they did clarify that relied upon software, if it applies to any real world testing related criteria, it must be included and addressed in your real world test plan. So again, maybe that wasn't in what you did in your first year, your 2022 real world test plan, but last year, 2023, and moving forward, you absolutely need to make sure any criteria that has relied upon software that's in your plan has that listed. And then again, sorry, go ahead.
Yep, I was just going to say, I think, real world testing has always included the relied upon software because by default, when you're executing the plans and you're using a third party, part of those test results do that, but they just had never called it out in the completeness check or on the template. So the biggest change is really to making sure that you have it all documented, whereas we know you're probably using it. It also needs to be part of the formal plan now and not just really in the, production of your results.
Yeah, it's a great point.
Yeah.
And then just the last thing, just to reiterate again what we said before, your measurement or your metrics, it needs to be just something measurable from a standpoint of a numerical value. So error rates, numerator, denominator, wherever possible, and just make sure you stay away from, a simple pass fail or yes, no metric, because obviously those are reasons why we'd have to send the plan back to have additional modifications made. So, over today's discussion, we've talked about some other documentation or resources out there. What's available for, both Drummond customers or, anybody from the ONC as far as real world testing documentation?
Yeah. So the ONC has some great guidance out there that they've come up over time, and they usually kind of do a review each year and make any changes if it's applicable. But they have a resource guide out there on their website. And in that resource guide, it has links to the fact sheets. It has links to the certification companion guide, or we always refer to it as the CCG, which is really the specifics of the requirement. And then it also has links to the actual regulatory guidance of where this all started, right? So their document is really just a different version of that, but you can also go and actually look at the regulatory language. They've also conducted several webinars that are out there recorded and available on that website as well. So you can kind of see which key elements, and then they kind of expounded on some of those in their webinars as well. So there's those things.
And do folks have to use like a predefined template, or just those elements that you talked about earlier in whatever format that they prefer? How's that preferred?
Yeah, so that's good. The ONC's actually put out a optional template. They have it for both the plans and the results, but really you could do it two different ways. You could use their optional template just as a guide. So you can kind of create your own in your own format, but use it as a guide to make sure that you're capturing all the required elements in whatever order you'd like. You could also just use their optional template directly and just fill out the fields and turn it in that way. Either way is appropriate, but it is a good resource to make sure, especially if this is your first time doing a real world test plan. This is a good guide just to kind of see the steps and make sure that you're including everything in that template as well. And then, if you're a Drummond customer, there are some things. We have an extensive knowledge base that we had to keep up to date on our customer portal for the customers. And then it goes over the review, and then we try and update the guidance as we get guidance and as those kind of things come out. And then, keep in mind that, make sure that you're signed up to be a compliance contact, because we have an automated process that sends a task reminder when you're ready, when the plan submission window is open, that you can kind of just go right to the portal from. So make sure that all your compliance contacts are kind of up to date there as well. And then we can also, open a case with one of our account managers or us, and we can kind of provide you that support as well. So, and we have some other Drummond resources, of course. So.
All right, thanks, Heather. So yeah, as we get closer to the end of the session, so just the last thing I wanted to just reminder was dates regarding real world testing before we kind of take a look at some of the questions that came in. So as a reminder, for Drummond customers, and other ACBs may be slightly different, so make sure you check with them if applicable. But our submission window from our portal, like Heather mentioned, opens on September 1st, and you'll have through November 1st to submit that. So during that time, again, we'll review it for any of those required data elements, perform that completeness check, and then if there's any suggestions or changes that we need, we'll work with you to make sure it's publicly accessible prior to that ONC deadline. And again, that ONC deadline, the drop dead deadline to get them on the chapel is December 15th. So again, if it's not submitted and publicly available and approved before that deadline, it may result in a corrective action plan, which could have that kind of downstream effect, like I mentioned earlier, about your condition and maintenance of certification needing to be saying non-compliant for the real world testing piece of that. So obviously we don't want that to happen to anybody. So
Right.
Make sure you get your plan submitted, well in advance of that deadline.
Yeah, and again, look out for your tasks, right, that we're sending if you're a Drummond customer. And then if you have another ACB, right, probably have a process in place. So just make sure you're adhere to the deadlines for your actual ACB and not necessarily the 1215, right, which is again what Jimmy stated is like the last step. So your ACB also needs time to review your plans ahead of time. So it's not always 1215, and it's usually not. So just keep that in mind. Perfect.
All right. So yeah, we're just going to take a minute and look for some questions. So
Yeah.
So I see a question from Marina. Good question, Marina. So Marina notes, for the results, do we need to just publish the results and provide you evidence of these links, or is there a live proctor test that needs to be completed? So for the results, there is no live, proctored test that needs to be completed. In your results report, you'll basically just spell out, the results, any findings. We don't need like further, I guess, that super detailed evidence. It's more just the high level metrics or whatever you put in your plan is what we need in the results. There's no live testing or, granular data that we need for the results report.
Yeah. So I see another question about API adoption by providers in the field is still low and very few have activated connections. Any indication from the ONC around what they're expecting for real world test results for API adoption? So they haven't said anything different about um, the API specifically, but again, they still have the guidance around if there's a low utilization or no utilization. There are some options for that mirrored production environment and setting up some test cases. So from the API standpoint, you could set up um, just just test patients to run through and count, the number of successful pulls on patient IDs and some other items with relation to G9 and G10 as well. So I would say, from that aspect, probably just kind of follow the guidance that they have for like a low utilized criteria or a no utilized criteria. But good question. Okay. And then I think we have one more question. So with B10 compliance becoming a condition of certification at the end of 2023, should it be included in the plan if implemented after 8/31? So the current guidance right now is if something is certified after that specific date, then it doesn't need to be included until the next year's plan. But we are seeking some guidance from the ONC currently about if it's like a replacement. So, right, B6 kind of existed and now it's going to turn into B10. So we're just trying to see, but realistically, it's going to be in place. So if you've already have like B6, for instance, and you are implementing B10, I would definitely include that in the plan. Again, if it's after the 8/31 date, it could be included in the next one. But if you've already got it going for B6, I honestly would just include it in your plan. But again, look for some additional guidance on our knowledge base, just a little bit about that as we get some clarification from the ONC as well. So I think that's all the questions that we have. So thank you for attending very much. We hope this was a helpful session for you. And feel free to reach out if you're a Drummond customer to our portal if you have any additional questions, or out to the CERT body or your account manager.